Hi, I'm James71 and today we're taking a look at the steering wheel settings that have recently been added to DIRT5. Now I'm playing on the PS5 version of the game with the Thrustmaster T150, but this will apply to all versions of the game and whichever steering wheel you wish to use. So first of all we need to go into your profile and down to settings, and input settings is where you'll find the new steering wheel setup. As you can see there, it's got the Thrustmaster T150 steering wheel connected. If I go to input reporting, you can see I've got my steering wheel input for when I turn the wheel. I've also got my throttle and my brake pedal. The pedals I'm actually using do have a clutch on them, but this isn't recognised by the game. It is an arcade game, so make of that what you will. You might find that the first time you connect the pedals, you might have to press them a few times in order for the game to calibrate it properly and properly fill those two gauges. So to actually change the device, you have to select it, of course. So we've got the input bindings and you can set them however you want. The only thing I've really changed from the default is the handbrake is normally on circle on the PlayStation, but that's a bit too far for my thumb. The steering wheel, so I've set it to a button that's a bit closer. Onto the advanced settings, and the first thing we have is steering linearity. Now this is a bit of a tricky one to explain, but it's a relationship with how many degrees your steering wheel turns compared to how far the steering on the car turns. Now this is different from your angle of rotation of the wheel or the steering saturation, which we'll come on to in a minute. At the default, where it's in the middle like it is now, it's more like a regular car in that every degree you turn your steering wheel, the steering of the car will turn a consistent number of degrees every time. So move it 10 degrees and maybe your car steering will turn a degree, 20 degrees turns another degree, and so on all the way through the wheel. So if you map that on a graph of how far you turn your wheel compared to how far the car wheel turns, it will be a straight line. Now with the steering linearity, it adds a bit of flex to that. It might change it so that a large deflection in the wheel compares to a small turn of the wheels at the beginning of the turn. And then as you get towards the full lock, a small turn of the wheel compares to a large turn in the steering, and vice versa. So if you plotted that on a graph, it would be like a bit of an S-curve. Like I say, it's different to your actual angle of rotation. Say on the default, where it's a consistent number of degrees for every degree you turn on the wheel, the car steering turns the same amount. If you changed your angle of rotation, all that's going to do is change the angle of the line on the graph. I would recommend leaving it on the default, because that's what feels most natural. To me anyway. And it's what you expect to see in a regular car. Steering dead zone. It's a bit like controller dead zones really. If you're finding that when your steering wheel is in the centre, you're still getting a bit of steering input to the game, just stick a few tabs on the dead zone, should get rid of that. I don't really have that issue on this wheel, so I leave my dead zone off. Steering saturation. Now this affects the angle of rotation. Now I've got a Thrustmaster T150 and has a max rotation of 1080 degrees. Now in the game, most of the cars have a steering rotation of 540 degrees. So what I could do, if I set that to half, that should be about 540. Now the big problem is there's no values on the screen, and you can move it in quite small increments. So I can't be exactly sure where 540 is or any value I wish to set it to. So I would recommend leaving the saturation up to full and actually changing the angle of rotation within your steering wheel settings. Now on my Thrustmaster T150, I can use the mode button with the D-pad to change the rotation, and I've changed it down so my wheel max rotation is 540 degrees. Changing on your wheel is a better idea than changing a saturation value that you can't see any values for. So throttle dead zone, similar to the other dead zone. Again, I've left that blank. Throttle saturation, if you want to get to max throttle without pressing your throttle all the way down, you can add a bit of saturation. You can change the saturation, but I'd rather have the full travel. Makes sense to me to keep the full travel. Same with brake dead zone. If you've got a brake, you don't want it to register for the first bit of the press of the pedal, add a bit of brake dead zone, but again, I leave that off and I use the full range of motion of the brake. Right, so onto vibration and feedback. Now I find that force feedback settings are very much personal taste, but what I'm going to go through is the values I've set for each one, what each one does in the game, and why I've set what I have. Now the method I had for choosing these is I actually played the game with everything turned off apart from one slider set to full, just to see what that actually controlled in the game. Once I'd done that with everything, I had a fair idea of what everything did and what I actually liked to use. Right, so the first one is vibration feedback, and that's greyed out for me. Now my steering wheel doesn't have a separate vibration system, like a controller would, for example. Any vibrations come through the force feedback settings. Force feedback, now this value actually controls the overall force feedback, so when you've set everything else below it, force feedback slider is a good way of quickly changing the amount of feedback that you get. I tend to leave it on about 3/4, that's strong enough for me. Anything higher than that just feels a bit unnatural, or you might want to play around with that. It depends on your wheel, because different wheels have different amounts of force feedback. Steering center force, now I find this a bit of a fake value. All this really does is it's how difficult it is to actually turn the wheel, and how much it's trying to fight its way back to the center. Now, it feels unnatural to me when you've got it set. It does do this a bit anyway, even with it on 0. But most cars have got power steering these days, so you don't have to fight to actually turn the wheel. So I turned it off, it feels more natural for me. Trigger feedback, I didn't find that did anything on mine. I assume it relates to controllers, unless your flappy paddles have got some sort of vibration feedback, which mine don't. So I've turned that off. ABS feedback, as it says, this gives you vibrations when the ABS systems on your brakes kick in. I have ABS in the game set to low, so I only feel this very subtly. If at all, in fact, even when I mash the brake pedal. I have turned the ABS up to full in the game and tried it out, and you do actually get a vibration. So I recommend about 3/4. Seems to be a natural amount, it'll allow you to feel it. You know the ABS has come on, but it's not going to be like in the way of everything else. So that's why I put it on 3/4. Self-aligned torque. A bit like steering center force, this is the car trying to straighten the steering wheel based on the terrain. So if you're going around a bend and you've got the steering wheel turned and you're counter steering, if you're hitting ruts and stuff in the ground, the steering's going to try and straighten itself up, and that's the force of trying to get this back, trying to get your steering wheel back to center. It's quite a good indication of which way the wheels on the car are pointed and what they're trying to do. But this is quite a strong force, I found. So I've only put it on 1/4. Now this gives you a good indication of the feeling of what the tyres at the front are doing and how what the steering's trying to do without overpowering everything else. Because I found that if you put it up high, every time you try and counter steer around a corner, you're just fighting against the wheel and it just overpowers everything else, and it didn't feel natural. So I've turned it down to that. Gives me a good indication what's going on without being a bit too mad. Engine. This is mainly for stuff like if you hit the rev limiter, or if you've got damage with the engine, you'll get some sort of feedback. Now I tried driving around on the rev limit and I didn't feel much feedback through this. It was only pretty subtle. I would imagine it's a bit higher if you've got a damaged engine. So I've put it on maximum because it seemed quite a weak force, and if you want to feel it at all, you're going to need it on full to get any sort of feedback. Collision. Right, this is a weird one. This seems to apply more to collisions with the ground, so bumps in the road and that kind of thing. I've tried ramming into a barrier at full speed, and I didn't really get anything registering through collision. If anything, it messed around with the self-aligned torque and wobbled the steering a bit. The most thing I found it with, like I said, it's hitting the road, bumps in the road, so it's great for feeling that kind of thing. It's not a very strong force, so I've whacked it on full. I found that gave me good feedback for what the road surface was like. Landing feedback is a special type of collision. That's where you land off a jump. Now, playing around with this, you needed a fairly big jump to actually feel anything through this, and it was a decent force, so I've put it on full. Because you want to feel that kind of impact of when you landed, it sort of adds to the immersion of the game, and it doesn't happen often enough that it gets in the way of the other force feedback. so I've left it on full. Now, surface feedback. This is a vibration that gives you an idea of what the surface feels like, as it says. On gravel, it kind of gives you a constant vibration, so you can feel the gravelly surface beneath the car, and it helps you kind of feel when the car's sliding around and things like that. I've put it on 3/4 because I didn't want it to overpower everything else, because it was quite a strong force, and I found that value gave me a good indication of what the surface felt like. You might want to mess around with it to see how it feels for you, but that was a good value for me, and it worked really well. Tyre slip. Now this was quite a weak force, I found, and it's meant to give you an idea of when your wheels are struggling for traction. So if your wheel's spinning or if the wheels are sliding, it felt similar to the surface feedback, but it was in slightly different occasions. It felt weaker than surface feedback, so I've put it up to full because I kind of felt it was important to feel what the tyres are doing. And I found that value combined with the self-aligned torque worked quite well for feeling the steering, but again, play around with it and see what you think. Hopefully that's given you a decent overview of what all the settings do. If you've got a Thrustmaster T150, you might want to try those settings out. Let me know in the comments how you get on with those. If you've got a different steering wheel, maybe try those different ratios of sliders and then fiddle around with the force feedback overall setting and see how it works for you. So I've been Jimster71. Thanks for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Dislike if you didn't. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If streaming's your sort of thing, I do that over on Twitch, so if you can give me a follow over there, that will be lovely too. But until next time, I will say bye for now.